Hey guys, what's up? Excoundrel here, and today we're going to be covering my second episode of Esports Insights. We are going to look at the esports system, and we're going to talk about whether it's flawed or not. That is something that a lot of you may not have considered, you may not have even asked that question, and you may not even be aware of how the system works in general. But I think it is good to raise these questions now, because we don't want to blindside ourselves by being convinced that our system is perfect and esports is on a meteoric rise. Because esports is rising, don't get me wrong, esports is growing exponentially, but the problems in our system may come back to haunt us if we aren't careful. So, if any of you have been to school, which I assume a large proportion of you have, you may have studied something called the feudal pyramid of power. The feudal pyramid of power is a simple concept that described the way that power was distributed in a medieval system. The king, who owned all of the land, gave portions of land to the nobles. The nobles, in return, gave money and knights to the king, so the king would be the head of the treasury, he would also command the army. The nobles would give land to knights and vassals. These knights and vassals would lead their small armies that would protect these lands. And in turn, the knights gave land and protection to the peasants whose basic living requirements were they need somewhere to live, they need shelter, they need food, blah 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 blah. So all the basic living requirements of the peasants were covered, and the land that they had was owned by the knights. In return, they would grow the food, they would harvest the food, and they would also provide the services. And this chain went all the way up, and this describes how power was distributed, and all really the commodity being land. So we can actually apply this model to esports. Now, this is a very basic structure, and obviously not all esports systems will look like this. For instance, Riot and Blizzard themselves don't have tournament organizers generally because they run the tournaments themselves. So you can cut out the ESL part for certain game developers. But let's talk about it as if the tournament organizers were part of this particular structure, because that is the case for someone like Valve, for instance, because Valve owns the games but they don't run the tournaments themselves. The game devs are like the kings. The commodity is the game. They own the game. They have to give the rights to the game to tournament organizers to produce tournaments. If a game dev did not want a tournament at a wide scale being played, they could very easily stop it whenever they wanted. The tournament organizers, with those rights, then look to create tournaments by which they will monetize or do whatever they want with them. Those tournaments are participated in by esports teams, and those esports teams, by participating in the tournaments, give themselves exposure as a brand. They also build fans by performing well, blah 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 blah. The esports teams have the players who they give brands and salaries to. Now, not all players are at the bottom of this power structure. For instance, I've got a picture of Doublelift here, who is a big enough brand in his own right that he could probably survive without an esports team. But not all players are like that, and players do rely on esports teams for exposure, especially some of the newer players. So, the pyramid of power is the players play for the teams. They play and represent the teams in tournaments, and by doing well, meet the needs of the esports teams. The esports teams participate in the tournaments, and by having those big names in the tournaments, the tournament organizer can generate more interest in their tournaments and more viewership and potentially more revenue for them to bring in. And by such, they meet the needs of the game devs, whose primary aim is to get people to either buy the game, increase the game player base, or buy stuff in-game. Now, of course, this is a more basic way of looking at the structure. There are definitely examples of players who can make money and make a living without the need for any parts of that pyramid. They can play games, they don't need to have permission to play the games, for instance. And I'm sure there are esports teams that are looking into ways to monetize without relying on the actual games that they play themselves. Now remember, esports is very different to traditional sports. No one owns football, no one owns basketball. These are games that have governance, and governance is a topic that we'll cover in another video for esports, but no one actually owns the sport. This is very different in esports. Game devs own the sport. That game, or that esport, is the source of their income. So, with that in mind, we're going to talk about incentives. Currently, as it stands, almost no publishers make money on esports. Now remember, the primary goal of a publisher is to make money from their game. So what do publishers gain out of esports? What are the incentives for them to actually put on, create, or sanction an esport based on the game they have created? Well, the majority of it is veteran player retention and increasing the player base. Because remember, publishers will make more money from either selling a game or making money from microtransactions in their game. So they want as many people playing actively as possible to increase the likelihood that they will have a higher revenue. The problem with this is that it completely misaligns with the way that tournament organizers and esports teams and fundamentally players benefit from esports. Because of the incentives and the goals of the game devs, who are the kings in our esports pyramid of power, remember, it means that they are going to want their esport broadcast, distributed, and seen by as many people as possible. That means by doing anything that would reduce the overall audience of the esport goes against what game devs actually want. That means paywalling, monetizing content, in any way, shape or form, reducing the overall audience is going to actually go against what the game developers want from their esport, which is that way to digitally advertise or market or retain players. As I said before, this fundamentally disagrees with how esports teams, tournament organizers, and eventually players make money from the esports specifically. By paywalling, by increasing revenue from viewers, by finding ways to monetize the viewing experience, that means that those teams, the tournament organizers, and fundamentally the players are going to make more money. But because they aren't on the top of that pyramid, they actually have no say. Of course, this is offset slightly. Franchised models, for instance, with revenue sharing, does enough to keep the teams happy. And that is an important part of the balance of esports right now. Game devs need to do enough to keep the teams happy. They don't want the teams or the players revolting to refuse to participate in their league, because that would be very, very negative PR for the company involved. But let me ask you this question, and this might highlight exactly what I mean. If, for instance, the NALCS, every professional organization pulled out of the NALCS because they didn't like the revenue share, they weren't getting what they wanted from it, would you stop playing League of Legends? If you're a League of Legends player, would you stop playing League of Legends? All of those thousands of hours, potentially thousands of dollars that you sunk into that game, would you stop playing and buying skins in the game because the esports teams pulled out of the esport? And then that's you that's aware of esports. How many people in the overall player base do you think actively participates in League of Legends esports? Do you think they care? So whilst it might have a minor impact on the game publisher, do you think it's going to have a big enough impact that they really care? That's the question I pose. This is a bit like an awkward prisoner's dilemma, where one of the prisoners has all of the power, but it's all about incentives matching up for the greater good. If both of our parties choose to monetize their content, it's likely that there will be a massive lull in the viewership on esports, and that might actually have negative impacts for both the teams and the game devs for a short period of time, but in the end may result in a better situation for everyone. If things remain the same, then it's going to be bad for both, and there is really no other way that this works. You either have both of them line up on incentives, or you don't, because remember, one of our prisoners has all the power. The other confusing thing about this is in terms of investments, and I do suggest you go and watch the first episode in this series to talk about the investments in teams. Usually, people invest in the land or the landlords, this either being the game or the game developer themselves. People don't usually invest in the peasants, which is why it's so perplexing that a lot of these esports teams have got massive, massive investments behind them. And like I said in my first episode, it is important for those esports teams to look to innovate, to make the best return on their investments that they can, otherwise we may be heading for a collapse in valuation. Unless teams and leagues become profitable in the long run, there is no way that the incentives of the game devs around esports change, and that may be a problem in the future. The last thing that I want to talk about before we talk about what I'm going to cover in the next few videos, and this last point is really setting up the theme for the next video as well, is we're talking about audiences as well as revenue streams from those audiences. In 2018, over 40% of esports revenue came from sponsorships, and sponsorships alone, 23.8% came from advertising. There was a small amount of media rights, merchandise and tickets, as well as other fees, but let's say that 60% of esports revenue came from the premise of marketing. Now, let's compare the average esports spend. Now, I believe the average esports spend was something like $5.60 or $6 or so this year, and that was per enthusiast. Now, looking at that compared to individual sports as well as compared to the NBA, esports has an audience which spends well below the average of traditional sports, which is a pretty big deal when you come to think about it, because a lot of these sponsorships and advertisements were sold on a return on investment for those sponsors. Remember, esports encompasses an audience which is traditionally hard to reach. It is actually known as like the golden audience for a lot of sponsors. It is 18 to 25-year-olds with good disposable income, and that is something that advertisers actually find very hard to reach. So esports was sold as this method of reaching this unreachable audience, which makes it very attractive for sponsors. People in their early 20s, even towards their late 20s like myself, have that disposable income to spend on goods. However, the average spend per fan is very low. And the fact that you also have in-game microtransactions. If you have a disposable income as an esports fan, are you going to spend it on the game, in-game microtransactions, for instance Overwatch League skins, or are you going to go out and buy one of these products sponsoring these individual leagues? There is a split in terms of where esports fans spend their money. And whilst you could say endemic sponsors like peripheral companies could definitely get some kind of return on investment, I think, you know, players using a certain mouse may definitely persuade some esports fans to buy that mouse. Let's talk about non-endemic sponsors, and these are the ones that are really bringing the money into esports right now. Are you really going to go and buy a piece of clothing because you saw Bjergsen wear it, for instance? Are you really going to go and buy a piece of clothing because you saw someone on an esports stream wear it? Is that where you draw your inspiration for that kind of purchase from? Or are you going to go in-game and buy a skin for TSM or for Cloud9 in your favorite game that you play? And so there could be a bit of a backlash, I think, and unless models change significantly and we get some major news that there's been huge returns on investments in the sponsorships and esports industry, there actually might be a bit of a backlash from the sponsors when they realize this actually isn't worth the money that we're putting into it. Now, one of the positives about the sponsorships in the esports industry is they are cheap comparatively for the audience that they reach. They are very cheap compared to traditional sporting advertising as well as traditional TV advertising. Also, lots of leagues are not tied up in multi-year contracts, so there is still plenty of space for advertisers and sponsors to look for. So in their mind, maybe they're getting a great deal, and if the return on investment isn't as big as they previously thought, it might not be too much of an issue. But it is definitely something that we need to think about as our industry progresses, because it is not all bells and whistles, and we do have to think a bit more responsibly about how we approach these situations. Next episode, we'll be talking a little bit about audience caps, as well as the vanity metrics that esports uses to try and compare it to traditional sports. And I'll give you a teaser. League of Legends is not bigger than the NBA. I'll see you soon.